In this section, we're gonna get to know about Angular components and its use cases. By the end of this section, we will learn what is Angular component and how to use them, how to create an Angular component from scratch, how to generate an Angular component using the Angular CLI, how to add HTML markups and styles to a component. At last, we will learn how to communicate and pass data between two components. So let's get started. The Angular framework is a component-based front-end framework. So the main building block of Angular is Angular components. Without components, we cannot build a proper Angular app. So what is this component? The component is a combination of data, HTML template and logics, which represent an area of a view that shows inside the browser. So this is the view that users can see, because components are loads inside the browser. So let's look at a real world example. So if I take the Facebook layout as an example, Facebook has this navbar, right sidebar, left sidebar, and this Facebook wall which shows Facebook posts. In Angular, we can create components for each of this layout area. We can create reusable components. For this navbar, we can create the navbar component, this sidebar, left side and right side, we can create separate sidebar components. And also for this post list, we can create a main post component, and also inside this main component, we can create a component for a post list. So we can create this all in one page like traditional web designs. In traditional web design, we added all the markups for the home page inside the index.html file. So like that, we can add all the markups for this Facebook home page inside the app.component.html file. So if you can remember, I show this app.component.html file. This is the main root file of the Angular. But it's not a good practice in Angular, because we can create separate components in Angular. If we create separate components, rather putting all in one component, we can reuse those components again in our application without coding it again. So what is this reusable thing? For example, this navbar must be shown on all pages. In this home page, and if we navigate to someone's profile, on that page also we can see this navbar. In that case, in Angular, we can reuse this navbar component inside all other pages. We don't need to write the code for navbar again and again. Hope you guys got the idea. So now we have an idea about the Angular component. Now let's see how to create an Angular component. When we creating a new Angular app, we got this app component. So this will be the main root component in Angular. Alright, let's create this simple layout using the Angular component. So we create separate components for each of this layout and we'll import that component inside this root app component. So as our example, first let's create this navbar component. In Angular, as a good practice, we will create all the components inside this app folder. So first, create a folder inside this app folder. The folder name will be navbar because we are creating a navbar component. Next, create a file inside this folder. Give a name. First, the component name navbar.component, and the file extension will be .ts. If you can remember, in Angular we use TypeScript instead of JavaScript for better and bug-free code experience. Angular already inbuilt the component function, so first we have to import the component module in order to work with Angular components. If you can remember, when we learn TypeScript, we learn TypeScript modules. The same thing we're gonna apply here. All the features of Angular components are inside of another file. So we have to import that file to this component file. At the top of this page, type import. Inside the curly brackets, module name, So module name is component. This C will be capital. Next, from. So in TypeScript, for this we have passed the path for that importing module. But in Angular we have to import the module name. Inside quotes @Angular /co. So this will be the path for this component. Actually, this is also like a path. All of the Angular files are installed inside this node modules folder. Inside this we can find this @Angular folder. Inside this folder we can see this core folder. So this is the component modules path. For this import, we are not added this node modules folder path because Angular already knows these files are inside the node modules folder. That's why we didn't add the node modules folder path in here. Okay, next we have to create the TypeScript class. First, the class name navbar component. So carefully follow these capital simple letters. Usually we use the camel case naming convention for class names. So first letter and all the new words first letter are capital, like this. After this, add the class scope, curly brackets. So still this file is not an Angular component. In here we just created this TypeScript class. In order to transfer this TypeScript class file to an Angular component, we have to add the TypeScript decorator class called component. So this is the decorator we imported earlier. Now we have to use this. So in TypeScript, we can define a decorator like this. First @ sign and the decorator class name component. This is also like a function. So after this parenthesis, inside this parenthesis, we have to pass some values as an object. Alright. First, we have to pass the selector value for this component. Selector colon and selector name will be app-navbar. In Angular, for this component selector, we give app as the first name and then we will give the component name. So this is just a common naming convention for an Angular component. So you may wonder, what is this selector? This selector also similar to CSS selectors in CSS. We use selectors to define CSS. For HTML element, we use the HTML tag name like this. If the element is body tag, we use the body selector. If we have a CSS class, we use something like this, dot and the class name. You got the idea, right? This is simple CSS. Like these CSS selectors, in Angular component also, we use this selector value to identify this component. Hope you guys got the idea. Alright, next we have to pass the template parameter for this. So we have to pass the HTML markup for this component. For example, for now I pass an h1 tag here, and between this h1 tag add this the navbar component and save this file. Now we have created the component with this component decorator. Next we have to register this component in Angular modules. Then only Angular knows this app as a navbar component. Otherwise this component will not work. So open this app.module.ts file. This is the main app module file. In here we have to register our newly created navbar component. So inside this app module file we can see these declaration, imports, providers and this bootstrap inside this ng module decorator. So don't worry about these all, we will learn this in later section. So in this component section we will learn about this first declaration. As you can see here, the main default app component is already registered here. Like this, we have to register our navbar component. First we have to import the navbar component to this file. So before we import the navbar component to this file, first we have to make the navbar component class export. Otherwise we cannot access this navbar component class inside another file. So back to the navbar component file and add this export before this class keyword. So if you can remember, we learn about this in the TypeScript section. Next, back to the app module.ts file, top of the page, add the import. import inside curly brackets. The component class name is navbar component. So once again, follow the capital simple letters carefully. After this, from and the path inside quotes dot slash. This is inside the navbar folder. So navbar slash navbar dot component. And one more thing, we don't have to pass the file extension. The Angular compiler already knows this extension. If you put the extension here, we will get this compile error. Okay, next we have to add this imported component inside the declaration, like this app component. After this, comma, and add the navbar component. Alright, we have successfully registered the Angular navbar component. So in order to see this component, first we have to run this app. So let's run this app. Open the integrated terminal on VS Code. Go to the view and select this terminal. Or we can use this keyboard shortcut, Control and the backtick key. Inside the terminal, run this Angular CLI command to run the Angular app, ng serve, and hit enter. So once it's completed, go to this URL on your browser. I will use Google Chrome as my default browser throughout this course. If you guys also can use the same browser, this will reduce the most of the errors. So go to this URL, localhost :/4200. For an Angular app, the default port will be 4200. In case if your computer using this port for any other servers, we can define the port when we running the ng serve. Just simply put the port flag and type a different port number like this. Alright, this is how the default Angular app landing page looks like. All these markups are inside the app component HTML file. So I don't want this, so I will remove this. So back to the VS Code and go to the app component HTML file and remove all these. After this, just put an h1 tag. Inside this h1 tags, add this Angular app. Save this file and back to the browser. So now we can see this h1 tag. Perfect. If we look at this code inside the inspect element tool, we can open the developers tool on Chrome, right click and inspect element, or the using keyboard shortcut Control, Shift and I. So inside this, we can see the h1 tag with some Angular attributes. These attributes are coming with the Angular, so don't worry about that. We are not going to deal with these attributes. So what I want to show is this app-root tag. In HTML, there is no element something like this. So what is this? If we open the app component TS file, inside this component decorator, we can see this selector app-root. So this is what we see here. Now you may wonder how this appears inside the browser. In Angular component, in order to show a component inside the browser, we will use this selector as an HTML element. So open this index.html file. As you guys know, this is the first file load inside the browser when we open the Angular app inside the browser. Inside this index.html file, we can see this app-root HTML custom tag. So this app-root tag represents the app component. So this is how we got this app-root element inside this inspect element. If I remove this component element from here, remove this, now we cannot see anything here, and also now we don't have the app-root tag inside this inspect element. So once again, we use this component selector as a component identifier. In order to render this component inside the browser, we use this component selector as an HTML custom tag. Hope you guys got the idea, right? So now, like this, I want to show this navbar component inside the browser. So the navbar component's selector is the app-navbar. So inside the app component HTML file, after this h1 tag, add the navbar component selector app-navbar and hit the enter. So you guys may wonder, why do we add this navbar component inside this app component file rather adding this straightly to this index.html like this app component? Because in Angular, we consider this app component as our main root component. We don't touch this index.html file. We only work within this app folder and we put all our components inside this app component. So this is just a standard in Angular. Alright, now save this all and back to the browser. Now we can see this navbar works text which is coming from this navbar component. And also we can see this Angular app h1 tag. So this is coming from our main app component. So this is how we work with components in Angular. So in previous we added this selector and template property inside this component decorator. You guys now know what is happening with this selector property. If we recap this, we use this selector to identify and render this component inside the browser. So now let's see what is the use of this template selector. You guys may already notice this. Inside this browser, we got this navbar works. From where do we get this? If we look at inside the code on the inspect element, we can see this app navbar tags. Between these app navbar tags, we have this h1 tag with this navbar works. So what is this app-navbar tag? So this is the navbar component selector. Inside that, we got this template values, this h1 tag. So inside this component decorator, we got this template values, this h1 tag. If I change this text to navbar template, save this, look at this. This value also changed to this navbar template. As we can see here, now we can understand this template is loaded inside the browser for this navbar component. So what is happening here? When we load this component inside the browser using this app component, this will display all the content of this template value inside the browser. So we use this template property to load HTML tags inside the browser. Hope you guys got the idea, right? So now we know how to show this component inside the browser using this selector. And also we can show HTML markups for this component using this template property. Now think, if we want to add a CSS style to this HTML element inside this component file, how do we going to do that? In order to add CSS for this template, we can use another component decorator property called style. Using this style decorator property, we can add CSS style to this component. Alright, let's see that in action. So let's change the color of this h1 tag. So in our case, CSS selector is this h1 tag. Next, the CSS scope. So inside this, we are changing the color of this h1 text. So CSS property is color, colon, and value is something red. Alright, save this and back to the browser. Perfect. So now as you can see here, now this h1 text is in red color. So this is how we add CSS styles to component. Alright, some of you may notice this. Usually we write CSS in multiple lines, not in one line like this, right? But in this component TS file, inside these codes, we cannot write multiple lines. If we add a line break here, we get this compile error. So we have to put everything in one line. For something simple CSS style like this is okay. But if any case we want to write some multiple lines of styles for this component, how do we going to do that? So in Angular component decorator, we can do that by using the backtick symbol instead of these quotes. which is located before the number 1 key in the keyboard. So let's remove this previous style and put the backticks. Inside these backticks, we can write multiple lines of codes without any errors. So let's write the previous style again, but this time we can write this in multiple lines. CSS selector H1 and the CSS scope. Inside the scope, set the color to red. After this, let's add another style inside this. So change the font size to something big, 50 pixels. Now save this and back to the browser. Beautiful, right? Now we have successfully wrote multi-lines of CSS inside our component TS file using the backtick symbol. And one more thing guys, I forget to mention that we can use this backtick method to write multiple lines of HTML markups also. So remove these codes and add backticks for this template. After this, let's put another paragraph tag and add some dummy text. Save this all and back to the browser. Awesome, right? Now we know how to write multiple lines of codes inside this component decorator. So in the previous section, we have created this navbar component. We put the HTML markups and styles inside this same page using these component decorator properties. So it's okay, but think if we have 100 lines of HTML markups and 200 lines of CSS styles, putting them all inside this TS file, it's make our code very noisy and unreadable. So that can cause lots of problems and bugs. When it's come to debugging, can't even imagine, right? As a solution for this, we can create a separate file for the HTML markup and a separate file for CSS. How do we do that? First, let's create the files. The first file is for the HTML template. So we are creating these files for the same navbar component. So create this file inside the navbar component folder. So create a new file and name this navbar.component. This time this is an HTML file. So the extension is HTML. Alright, next create the CSS file. The file name will be navbar.component and extension will be CSS. Please note this carefully. The naming convention is the same on these all three files. First, the component name navbar, and second, the component keyword, and third, the file extension. So this file extension can be various depending on the file types. And one more thing, this TS file is the main file for a component. So without that file, we cannot create a component in Angular. So hope you guys got the idea. Alright, we created the component HTML file and the component CSS file. Now we have to link these files to the navbar component. So go to the component TS file. In previous, we have added these HTML markups inside this template. Now we have to link the external component HTML file instead of these inline markups. For that, first remove these all markups. Next, we have to do a small change to this template property. So change this template to template URL. So this U is capital. So now this time this component decorator property is template URL. Alright. Now pass the component HTML files path as a path to this template URL property. The file is inside the same folder, so /, and the file name is navbar.component.html. That's it. Simple, right? So likewise, now we have to link the CSS file. So again, remove the existing inline CSS and change this style property to style URL. Then give the path of the component CSS file inside quotes dot slash navbar dot component dot css. Beautiful. We have successfully linked the external files for this navbar component. So save this file and go to the browser. Wait, what's going on here? We only see this app component, but we cannot see the navbar component markups. Why is that? Because if you can remember, we removed all the inline markups and we linked the external HTML and CSS files. So inside the navbar component HTML file, we don't have any markups. So this file is empty, that's why we are getting nothing inside the browser. So now let's add an h1 tag and put this navbar component inside this navbar component HTML file. After this, save this file and back to the browser. Perfect, right? Now we got this h1 navbar component which is marked in this external HTML file. Alright, let's add some style to this h1 tag. So inside this navbar component CSS file, write the style for this h1 tag, h1, and the scope. The color will be red. Save this and again back to the browser. As you can see here, external CSS style is applied to this h1 tag. That's why this h1 text turned into red color. Perfect. Now we have separate files for HTML markups and for the CSS. So we write all the markups inside the HTML file. We add all the CSS styles inside this CSS file and we add all the logics inside this TS file. So now we can work on this navbar component more efficiently. So in the previous section, we have created this navbar component from scratch. We code all of these from the beginning. Some of you may get these creating components very hard. Some of you may not. But don't worry, we have an easy way for this. We can create Angular components using the Angular CLI with a simple line of command. So inside the integrated terminal, just run this command. So ng, this command is coming from the Angular CLI. So G, this G stands for generate. Next C, this C stands for component, because we are creating a component here. And at last, we have to give the component name. So we already created the navbar component. So now let's create this post component. So the component name will be post. That's it. To run this command, just hit the enter. Alright, post component is generated successfully. If we look at the file structure, we can find this post folder inside this app folder. So inside this post folder, we can see these files: post component TS file, HTML file, and CSS file. So we learned about these all files and created these files in previous lecture from scratch. Now if you look at this further, in addition to these files, we got this another new file, this post component.spec.ts file. What is this file? This file is responsible for unit testing in Angular, which is beyond the scope of this course. So don't think too much about this file. So we are not going to deal with this file. Alright, first let's look at this TS file. So inside this we can see this import component and this component decorator. So inside this component decorator, we can see this property selector. Now this is app-post. So this selector will be used to identify this post component. Alright, next we can see this template URL for the component HTML file, and we can see this style URL and the path for the post CSS file. So if you look at this carefully, we can notice some few additional things on this page. Just leave these for now. We'll come to this in a moment. Now let's look at inside the post component HTML file. Inside this, we can find this simple default markup p tag saying that post works. So inside the CSS file, we got nothing. It's just a simple empty CSS file. Now go to the app-modules.ts file. Inside this declaration, we can see this post component register. This is the beauty of Angular CLI. If we create a component manually, we have to do this all step one by one from scratch. If we missed one of these steps, our app will break. And also, generating a component using Angular CLI, can you imagine how much of time this is saving for us? Awesome, right? Alright, now go to the browser. Still, we cannot see the post component here. Why is that? Because we just only created the component. That is not enough in order to show the component inside the browser. We have to put the component selector inside this app component. So if you can remember, we use the app component selector as an HTML custom tag. Go to the app component HTML file. So the selector is app-post and hit enter. So the VS Code IntelliSense will complete this as an HTML custom tag. So now save this and back to the browser. Perfect. Now we can see this post works, which means post component is now rendered inside the browser. So open this inspect element, and if we look further inside the elements, we can find this app-post tag. So this is how we can generate Angular components using the Angular CLI.